Hi, everyone, and a very warm welcome to all of those who are joining me here in my little cubby hole, hidden away in the Scottish Highlands for yet another photo share. I can see that there are some friends that joined me last week for the very first photo share from South Africa, and welcome to Veronica from Estonia. I think you're the first person we've had from Estonia here, and I can see Peter, who's a fellow guide from Nantucket Island, has also managed to join us this evening. And a very good welcome, a good morning to Warren from New Zealand. And I'm sure there are many others from across the world who are joining us this evening. I'm Andrew Baxter. I'm a professional guide. And as I said, you're joining me from my little hideaway deep in the Scottish Highlands. It's been an amazing week here in the Highlands. Wall-to-wall sunshine since last weekend. I know it's difficult to believe because we have a reputation for it raining continuously in the Scottish Highlands in particular, but the weather has been fantastic. Il scorchio, we might say, and long may it continue, even though we're continuing in lockdown for a few more weeks yet, so that we might not be able to enjoy it as much as we'd like to. Now, it's good to see everyone is saying hello in the chat bar. So if you want to introduce yourself or make any points, you'll see that there's the chat bar on the right-hand side of the screen. And then right at the bottom of the screen, somewhere underneath me here, is a question box. You can also pop questions in there throughout the evening, and I will be endeavoring to answer as many of those as we go on through the photo share. And if I can't, for whatever reason, get through all of them, I will endeavor to make sure that I answer them afterwards in one way or another, whether it's direct to you or at the bottom of the screen, so that no one's question goes unchecked. Well, it's been an interesting time recently. The Scottish Government here has announced a further lockdown, and last week I started my photo share with a nice glass of malt whiskey because I hadn't been guiding very much this year, so my vocal cords needed a bit of lubrication. And then one of our guests from South Africa told me that in your country at the moment, the president has declared that alcohol is banned or can't be purchased. So I thought I would join you in solidarity tonight and make sure that I just had a nice glass of clear Scottish spring water straight from the mountains above my village to keep me going this evening. So here's Slán Javar to all our friends in South Africa. I'm feeling very sorry for you at the moment that you can't enjoy your delicious South African wines. But of course, who am I kidding? There would be a complete riot in Scotland here if we were prevented from enjoying our malt whiskey. But tonight, because it's been so hot, I've decided to go for a nice glass of cool, refreshing Scottish beer. This is from the Isle of Skye, where we're heading to this evening. So, Slán Javar once again. Your very good health. And as we're heading to Skye, that's quite appropriate because many people ask me as a tour guide whether I can speak any Gaelic. And unfortunately, I've always been really bad at speaking and learning languages, but the only word you really need to know of Gaelic to get you around our glorious country is Slàinte. And I see Nadia has even spelt it right on the chat box right down there at the bottom. So Slàinte means your good health, or cheers, or bottoms up from wherever you might come around the world. So we're heading to Skye this evening. I'm really excited about this. It's one of my favorite places to go guiding. I welcome many guests from across the world there every year, and it's an extremely popular place at the moment. Many people are attracted to it because it's been voted the fourth best island in the world by National Geographic magazine. It's made it into things like Lonely Planet and the Rough Guide as being one of the top 10, if not the top island to visit in the world if you've got a bucket list. And many people are therefore concerned that it can be a little bit crowded. And that's for sure some of the most popular places around the island. Some of the ones that we're going to visit this evening can get a little bit busy in summer. But if you're thinking of coming here, once lockdown has been lifted, when the travel restrictions have disappeared, maybe next year you're planning to come again to Scotland or here for the first time, don't be put off by what you might read about Skye. Even in the height of summer, there are still plenty of places off the beaten path that you can get away from the crowds and you can enjoy the solitude and the splendor of the scenery. And I'll be pointing out some of those this evening for you. Now, it's possibly Scotland's most well-known island. It has a great Gaelic heritage. About 40% of the island can speak Gaelic, and right up in the northeast of the island, where we'll be heading later on during this photo share, some of the villages there, 60% of the population can speak Gaelic fluently. And that gives us its modern Gaelic name, Isle of Skye. I hope there may be a few Gaelic speakers out there, some of my fellow guides from elsewhere in Scotland. I've probably pronounced it hopelessly wrong, but it's in essence, it means the Misty Isle. I often think when I head over there that maybe it would be more appropriate to call it the Rainy Isle, because it has a staggering 1,300 millimeters of rain every year, and all of that rain seems to dump itself upon my head all in the space of a couple of hours when I'm there. But even with the rain and the mist, and even if you get unfortunate in the howling wind, it is still the most amazing atmospheric place to visit. So I'm going to open up my photos this evening, and we'll get going on our journey across to Skye. So there we are. There's in the background is the Skye Bridge taking you from across the mainland at the Carl of Lochaush across to the island itself. Now the bridge is relatively new. It was only opened in 1995. It was built in 1995, and for best part of 2 decades before that, people had been saying that it was completely unviable. You were never going to be able to build a bridge from the mainland to the Isle of Skye, and there it was eventually built, opened in 1995, and it transformed the economy of the island overnight. But it also brought many new challenges to the island that hadn't perhaps been so used or prepared for mass tourism. But it also led to some really bitter campaigning, because in order to fund this magnificent bridge, the government of the time organized a private company, private finance, and to repay the cost of building the bridge, they introduced tolls, and they were the most expensive tolls on any bridge anywhere in Scotland. People went to court because they were arrested for failing to pay their toll, and then they refused to pay their fines as well. And eventually, after nearly 20 years, the then government in Scotland, under the new Scottish Parliament, removed all tolls on every bridge in Scotland, and we can now travel across to the island completely free of charge in our car or our camper van or our coach. And in many ways, that's lost a bit of the old charm of heading across the water to get to Skye. But we'll soon come to that in a second. And the other problem that has happened, and which is a real shame, is when you head across that bridge and you turn northwards up towards Broadford and Portree, you miss out a rather pleasant village right down on the water's edge, which used to be full of hubbub, as it was the place that the ferries used to come into before the bridge was built, a place called Kyleachen. And it's a really pleasant place and a quiet place these days. Not many of the tour coaches head there. They head up into the other delights of the island. And so many visitors who come to Skye are missing so much. As a result, they're missing the ruins of this little castle that you can see on the headland behind the marina there, Castle Mule, on its rocky outcrop. Dates back to well over to about 900 AD is the first written records that we certainly have of it, when there was a Norse princess who had come across from Scandinavia, married a local chieftain, and she was safely ensconced in the castle. She soon earned the nickname Saucy Mary, because although the bridge in later centuries you had to pay to get across, well, Saucy Mary had a ruse where she charged local sailors sailing between the island and the mainland through the narrows there. She charged them to do so. She organized a huge chain to be strung across the narrowest point that could be lifted up to prevent ships going past until they had paid their toll, and then it would be lowered. And the reason she was called Saucy Mary, apparently, was she would show her gratitude to the captains of the ships as they passed by, having paid their dues, by giving them a quick flash over her breasts, so we are told. And today, if you visit Kyleachen, the local pub is called Saucy Mary's. It's not a place I've ever ventured into for fear of my wife believing that I've visited a less than salubrious particular place on the island. And there in the foreground, we have a wonderful statue of an otter, and that is to commemorate a particular man, a man called Gavin Maxwell, who lived in an island, in fact, an island which the bridge is built upon now, and that's Teco, the otter. He lived with otters on the island, and some of you may have heard of perhaps his most famous book, The Ring of Bright Water. And it's very well worth, if you can get hold of a copy of that, having a read of it. Is a charming book and an absolute delight to read. So that's Kyleachen. And I said we've lost a bit of the charm of not being able to go across by boat to Skye today. Well, you can. There's a main scheduled service right at the south of the island from Mallaig to Armidale on a Calmac ferry. But there's an even better way, in my mind, to get there, and that's on a small ferry between Carlrea and Glenalg, not too far along the coast from Kyleachen in this picture. And I'm going to try and get this video up so you can have a look at this particular video that I took. I think it was the very last day of service of the ferry last year. I took this particular video coming across towards Skye there. Really little ferry. And if you can hear a beep come on the screen, that's because I was on the slipway and the captain thought I was a bit too close and was warning me to head off. So that's the Glenalg ferry. It's community owned now, that particular ferry. The community bought it several years ago to keep it operating there. There's a close-up of it. And what's really unusual about it is, as you can probably guess from that photo, is that it's a turntable ferry, and the crew have to get out and push the deck of the ferry around onto the slipway there to allow people to get on and get off. And it can only take 6 cars across the narrow strait that you can see there. And it's quite an extraordinary journey, because you can't quite get it from that photo there or the video that I showed you earlier, but the currents going through the narrows there as the tide turns can run at 7 to 8 miles per hour, and it takes enormous skill by the ferrymen to get you across there. They have to go on a big arc around across the narrows to get lined up just right. And whenever I go on it, I always think they're going to overshoot and not quite make the slipway, but their skill is amazing, and they always manage to do so. And the other advantage of heading across to the island in this particular way is you end up crawling along, zigzagging along this amazing single track a road. We're virtually at the top of it there, looking back towards the ferry and across to the mountains of Kintail in the distance there, across the Narrows on the mainland. It's an amazing a road to drive along, and if I was to turn the camera around here at this point, you would get your very first sight of the mountains of Skye off in the distance, where the Coolins, as we call them, and we'll be heading there very soon later on in our journey. Now, Skye has many stories associated with it, and many of those are associated with the clans, and 2 clans in particular, the Macdonalds and the Macleods, for many centuries dominated the island. And I was rather concerned when people were registering for this evening's event, that people were emailing me about some of their family heritage. And I had people that had told me that they had managed to trace back their roots as Macdonalds to Scotland. And then there were others that had told me that they were Macleods. So I'm rather glad that this is a virtual photo share tonight, because having Macdonalds and Macleods in the same room or in the same tour car could be somewhat frosty or a bit dicey, because the Macdonalds and the Macleods were sworn enemies, not just on the Isle of Skye, but across the western seaboard for many centuries. So we're going to head deep into Macdonald territory on the Slate Peninsula, right down on the southern coastline of the island. It's called the Garden of Skye. It's the most fertile part, and often a part where most people just drive through, having headed off the Mallaig ferry and zooming along the road to get to Broadford, or vice versa, in case they may miss their ferry if they're too late. So it's often a place that isn't explored extensively, which is a real shame, because there's some really interesting places to visit, and not least of all this place, Armadale Castle, which is the clan seat of the Macdonalds of Skye. There was originally a house built here by the Macdonalds back in the late 1600s, and that very first house was soon burnt down after that by William III, because the Macdonalds had been a bit tardy and a bit late in swearing an oath of allegiance to the king, And the king determined to make a show of things and to make it quite clear that the clan chiefs were not going to ignore his royal authority, ordered it to be burnt down. And it was then subsequently rebuilt as the main residence for the Macdonalds in the early 1800s, about 1815, I seem to recall. And then it was subsequently remodeled. But you can see from the photos here that it is in ruins. There's no roof upon it. There's not very much left of it at all, other than the walls. And that's because the Macdonalds eventually, because it was a rather unwieldy building for a modern life, moved out in the 1920s. And the castle was neglected and eventually fell into ruins. And it looked as though it was going to collapse completely until the Clan Donald Trust, made up of the diaspora from across the world, people that are part of Clan Donald, purchased the estate and the castle itself. They've done a lot of work to stabilize the castle, and you can visit it today, and the excellent Museum of the Isles, which is within the gardens of the castle. So that's Armadale Castle, the clan seat of the mighty Macdonalds, at one point known as the Lords of the Isles, who had dominated the western seaboard of Scotland. And this particular branch of the family, the Macdonalds, came across and settled on the Isle of Skye from the Western Isles in around about the 1400s. Then we're going to move all the way to the north of the island now, the northwest of the island, I guess, to the heart of Macleod territory. And there on its rocky outcrop, a big lump of basalt rock, is Dunvegan Castle. The oldest parts of it date back to the 13th century, but it's really, if you got up close, really a Victorian restoration in sort of romantic way, which was the Victorian way of doing things. And the Macleods have been around for at least 700 years in the castle on this spot. And they used to hold extensive lands across Skye, but unfortunately today only clan lands are around the castle in particular. And they have an extremely precious object within the castle displayed on one of the walls, a piece of a yellow silk with some red dots that you can just about make out on the flag. And this is known as the fairy flag. It's possibly the most precious item for the Macleod clan. And the tale says that many centuries ago, a chieftain of the clan met and fell in love with a young lady that he had come across whilst walking one day across his extensive estate. And they fell in love with each other, but it turned out that this was no normal young lady, but it was a fairy princess. But the chieftain was so determined to marry this fairy princess that he begged the king of the fairies for his permission to wed her. And the king of the fairies eventually granted that wish, but it was on condition that they returned a year and a day later after they were wed, for the fairy princess to return to the fairy kingdom. And they spent the most blissful year together within the castle at Dunvegan before remembering the promise that they had made, and they prepared themselves to say goodbye. But in that year, their marriage had produced a son which both of them loved dearly. And the fairy princess must have been distraught at the knowledge that she had to return and she had to leave her young son behind. And she made the chieftain promise that he would never allow their young son to cry. And they bid farewell to each other, and the princess returned to the fairy kingdom. And the chieftain's friends saw that he was glum, and it's hardly surprising, having lost the love of his life, and they decided to organise an enormous feast, a ceilidh with music and food, and the great hall in the castle would have been decorated for this ceilidh. And the young son was laid in his crib, and the festivities began. But his nursemaid, determined to join in the festivities, crept away from the crib, leaving the sleeping baby, and wandered down the stone staircase into the great hall and watched from behind a curtain. But she could hear in the distance all of a sudden the bawling and crying of her young charge in the distance, and she leapt up and ran back to the very top of the tower to comfort him. But by the time she had got there, he had settled once again, and as she entered the room, she went across to his crib, and she discovered that he had been wrapped in a yellow silk piece of cloth with tiny little red dots, fairy dots, all around it. And it wasn't until many years later, until the young boy was old enough to talk, that he suddenly remembered the visit of his mother that night, who had comforted him and wrapped him in that yellow piece of silk. And as she lullabied him to sleep, she whispered to him that that piece of fabric could be used 3 times when the Clan Macleod was in danger. And the chieftain, hearing this prophecy and realizing how precious this piece of fabric was, this piece of silk was, locked it away in a wooden chest. And only he had the key to that chest. And in the centuries that have passed, the flag has been raised, we know of, on 2 occasions. The first, after the Macdonalds had attacked the clan, and the chieftain took the flag from the box and flew it from the castle tower, and it is said that the Macleods increased tenfold in order to beat back their Macdonald foes. And on the second occasion, there was a terrible plague that had swept across the clan lands, killing many of the cattle. The clansmen were starving, and once again the chieftain returned to the box, took out the precious fabric, and waved the flag. And it is said that fairy folk rode down from the surrounding mountains, restoring the cattle to health and bringing good fortune to the clan once again. So that's the tale of the fairy flag of the Macleods that is still to be found in Dunvegan Castle. Now, I've told you all about the Macdonalds and the Macleods fighting it out with each other, and they did this continuously over the centuries. And I think after the bit of clan rivalry that we've had, it's about time to stop for a pause, maybe a bite to eat at lunchtime on our journey today. And what better place to do that than in the main town of Portree on the island, with its pretty coloured buildings lining the harbour front there. And in one of those buildings there, you'll find the most amazing fish and chip shop. The perfect place to get your fish supper, as we would call it, and then sit on that harbour wall. And it's also the perfect time for me to have a sip of my beer to refresh myself and just double check to see if anyone has any particular questions before I head on further around the island, whether there's any Macdonalds or Macleods secretly keeping quiet out there for fear of provoking their clan rivals into anger after all these centuries. Well, no, it doesn't look as though there's going to be any particular argument into today's photo share. Our Macdonald's and Macleod friends who are out there are keeping their peace for at least the time being this evening. So we're going to head away from Portree now, I think, and we're going to explore a bit of the landscape of the island. And most people would do so by taking the narrow road with passing places that winds up the hill out of Portree behind this particular viewpoint, and they're heading to the Trotternish Peninsula, where all the best landscape in many people's view is to be located. And I just wanted to say a little bit about the landscape before we get there. So most of the island's been shaped by enormous volcanic eruptions. About some 65 million years ago, at the time, North America decided to split away from the rest of Europe and drift across the Atlantic Ocean. And that volcanic rock is set atop a much older, harder rock, older base rock that dates back around 2,800 million years ago. And over the millennia, huge glaciers have carved away the rock and left many of the sculpted forms that we see today, and where we are particularly heading to now around the Trotternish Peninsula. And our first stop is going to be the famous Old Man of Storr. And you can just about make out the old man in this photo. So if you look at the cliffs on the left-hand side of the photo, with the clouds just skirting across the top, and come down to the right of the cliffs, you'll see a slender bit of rock pointing up heavenwards, and that's the Old Man of Storr. And whenever you travel along this road, it's quite difficult to get a good viewpoint of the rock. It's south from the road. You really need to put on your walking boots or your walking shoes and head up along that a ridge line that you can see moving across the picture from right to left to the higher ground and the Old Man itself. And we're going to get up a bit closer in a second, but first of all, I wanted to tell you about the legend of the Old Man of Storr. And it's said to be named after a man who lived locally called McSween. And it's said that he had saved a broonie from death. Now, a broonie is one of the creatures that you would come across in yesteryear across the Highlands. Hopefully you wouldn't come across them today, because they are extremely ugly, small creatures, always naked, and they live at the bottom of the sea. And they love nothing better than eating the bones of drowned seamen. So they're not particularly pleasant creatures. So we don't know why McSween had taken pity on this particular broonie, but he had, and his wife, Mrs. McSween, had, being a deft seamstress, had tailored some clothes for this broonie so that he was no longer naked, and they were the best of friends. And this relationship continued, this friendship continued for many years, until all of a sudden, Mrs. McSween died of a heart attack. And within days, Mr. McSween had died of a broken heart, leaving the broonie that he had saved behind on his own. And the broonie was so upset that it said that he carved the pinnacle that we can see jutting out on the skyline there in memory of his dear friend. So that's why it's the Old Man of Storr. And nearby, there's a much slender needle, which is said to have represented Mrs. McSween and the needle that she had used to sew the Bruni's clothes all those years before. Now, there's a fine day in this particular photo across Storr Locks to the old man, but it won't surprise you that it's not always like that there. It can be a bit dreich, as we would say. The weather can become a bit inclement, and it can look a bit like this, a bit close up. So in the middle distance there, just in the murk and the clag, you can see the Old Man of Storr, and I'm very grateful to Karina Bendish from Tobermory, and I think California before that, who has given me this photo from a couple of years ago. And I think the next photo is an even closer one of the old man. There we are. And I just go back to that wider shot there. And she gave me a little story when she sent me the photo. She said that the mountain did what Scotland is famous for on the day that they've visited. I can't think what she means at all. She says, we started out with good weather, and as we arrived, the mist was coming down the mountain. That sounds very atmospheric indeed. And as we got about halfway up, the wind started to gale, and the rain started teeming down. Well, she used a different word than teeming, one that I can't repeat on air. And she goes on to say, we had a 79-year-old spry English girl with us who may have weighed all of 90 pounds. And in this gale and in this rain, we found a rock with a tiny seat in it for her to shelter. And 3 of us had umbrellas. Now, I can't understand why anyone would go to the Isle of Skye with umbrellas. They're extremely brave in doing so. I'll be very interested to know how long they lasted in this particular squall. And with these umbrellas, Karina says they kept her and the other 6 folks fairly dry for the 20 or 30 minutes of unsuitable weather to slack off a bit. Then she goes on to say the area looked like a scene out of the Lord of the Rings, and I hope you can get a feel for that there in that photo. And it's interesting that the producers of the Lord of the Rings are making a prequel, and they've actually been to the Isle of Skye in the last year on sort of scouting scenic locations, and there's quite a lot of rumors that they will be filming large parts of this particular production that will be, I think it's on Amazon or Netflix that it's going to come, will be filmed on the Isle of Skye. So watch out for that in future years, the Lord of the Rings prequel TV series. But the weather does clear from time to time. You can see the clouds skidding across the island there, and that's from below the old man looking back across Storr Locks where we were stood just a few moments ago with a road bending around below. So where are we going to head on our next point on the island? Well, I'm going to head to a photo that Peter Brace, a guide from Nantucket Island, sent across to me. And I've chosen this because this is quite an unusual viewpoint for this part of the island. And it's up there on the northeast coast somewhere. I'm still trying to work out exactly where it might be. I think it's around the corner from the Old Man of Storr, looking back towards it with the old man beyond that ridge there. But it's a good example of how those glaciers have carved out much of the rock around, had a big impact on the scenery there. So thank you very much for that photo, Peter. And I think the next one is yours as well. Kilt rock with the waterfall flowing down into the sea. popular a viewpoint, and you can just make out in the distance the bottom of the cliffs there, just in the distance. And it's said that the rock formation there is a bit like the pleats on the back of a Scotsman's kilt, and in the sunlight you can definitely see that. I'm never entirely convinced. And now, one thing I do know is Kilt Rock is not the place to wear a kilt. And I know that from experience. It's an extremely windy spot. And I always seem to forget that I'm going there when I'm on a tour, and I put on my kilt to display it to my guests. And then I find the wind has whipped up, and you head out to the viewpoints and the railings looking down over the waterfall there. And it can be a bit difficult to keep your kilt down in windy weather. So if you're thinking of coming to Scotland and donning a kilt, I wouldn't recommend wearing it to a visit to Kilt Rock. And we're heading slightly further north around the peninsula now, and this is one of my favourite spots, the Kerrang. You have to go along that single track road, which is extremely twisty, turning, extremely narrow, to get to the top of the pass here, where you can park, and then you can walk out along the cliffs that you can see in the top left hand corner, and take a closer look at the pinnacles. The Kerrang is on the route of an old drove road from Uig, so that the cattle drivers would drive their cattle across this pass. And it is said that in amongst these rock formations, you could hide large herds of cattle from invading Norsemen away from the Vikings. And some of these rock formations have fantastic names, like the Table, the Needle, and the Prison. It's certainly a rather dicey road in summer, and I recommend you Googling, if you get a chance, the Kerrang and coach driver, and you should come across a YouTube video when a full-length coach and its a driver decided that he was going to take them up to the Kerrang, and you will see what happened when he got stuck on one of the hairpin bends, and his coach couldn't go forward and it couldn't go backward. It was stuck fast. I would imagine he was extremely red-faced indeed. And our last stop, as we zoom round to the Trotternish Peninsula, is the extremely popular Fairy Glen. I really do not know how to describe the Fairy Glen. It's really difficult to do it justice in photos. This is a pretty good one, a lovely bench to sit upon and gaze across the little loch in there. But it is the most amazing rock formations all around, 360 degrees around this particular spot, with little pathways to scramble along, and little fairy knolls, the wee folk, as we call them in the Highlands. The fairies are said to reside in little hillocks, little knolls like those that you can see in this picture. And so I guess that's why the Fairy Glen got its particular name. But we haven't got enough time to dwell in Fairy Glen, so we're going to head off to some places that are maybe a little less known to people, and are well worth a detour. So we've headed all the way back to the south of the island now, to the Slate Peninsula, and this photo of Dunscaith Castle. There's not much left of the castle now, which was built in the 1300s. You can see the little archway with a collapsed bridge across it that goes across to the headland, and see a little bit of rock wall around it. And this was one of those castles that went from one clan to another. So it was built by the MacAskills, taken by the Macleods. The Macdonalds came along and they tried to take the castle and they failed. and they tried and they tried and they tried again, and they eventually took it, only to abandon it eventually and move elsewhere on the island. And it's said that when the castle was originally built, it was built in just one night with the assistance of a local witch. So this is Dun Scaith castle, not far from Armidale, along one of those twisty, turny, narrow roads, and a little walk out about 20 minutes across to the headland to explore the castle, as my family are here. So this is a bit lower down, looking up to that ruined bridge that would have taken you across to the castle keep when it was a mighty castle, the stronghold of the MacAskills, who had built it. And if you were to go through the archway of that bridge, you are rewarded with this fantastic sight across the sound there, with the Cuillin Mountains. The red Cuillins are the gentler, more rounded ones. You can see some of the red Cuillins off on the right hand side, and then the black Cuillins are the darker basalt rock, and they're more jagged, that you can see they're more alpine in nature, and that's their mountain chain that stretches across the middle of the island, making it extremely popular with hill walkers and mountaineers. In fact, the burgeoning sport of mountaineering in the 1800s, many of the techniques that were tried on the mountains on the Isle of Skye. So hope you enjoyed your short visit to Dun Scaith Castle, a little known place. Whenever I've been there hasn't been another person around. And I've just come into my head another story about the castle. It said that it was built on a place where there had been an ancient fortress for many centuries, if not thousands of years before, and it was the home of the legendary school for heroes run by the Celtic warrior queen Scatach. I hope I pronounced that right, Scatach, whose name is reflected in that of the castle of Skye. And this is where it is said that she trained the Irish hero Cuchulainn in the art of war, and that's why the mountains that you can see in the distance are called the Cuillins, after the Irish hero Cuchulainn. So we're going to move on around the Slate Peninsula now to another place, and this is courtesy of Peter Brace as well. And I've included this because this is a little known place. This is the Isle of Skye, a little village on the southern coast with a nice natural harbour, as you can see there, and in the distance the mountains of the mainland. And this was a safe anchorage for the Macdonalds and their boats for many centuries, and then it became a thriving fishing port as the herring fisheries took off in the 1800s, and eventually it became the very first tourist resort on the Isle of Skye. As steamships plied their way up the west coast from Glasgow, they would come to the Isle of Skye. And I'm also told it was the spot of the very first public toilet on the Isle of Skye in 1820. So obviously a popular destination for visitors. It's one of the first places you always look for when you stop is the local convenience. And if you were to turn around from this shot, you would see the village itself with these lovely whitewashed buildings down on the harbour front there. So that's Isle of Skye, a delightful place to spend a few hours. But we're not quite finished yet. We've still got another place to visit. I've headed all the way up to the top of the island, now all the way to the very tip of the Trotternish Peninsula. And this is a place called Duntoon Castle, the fort on the grassy headland, it means. And I would imagine, I don't know, 8 out of 10 people drive past this without it realizing it's there. And it's a crumbling castle. You can see the fence there protecting you from the sheer drop down into the sea below. And in the distance, you can see in the clouds there on the horizon, the Western Isles out across the ocean. And beyond that will be the Atlantic Ocean. And Duntoon Castle, even though it is right in the north of the island, and you would expect it to be a Macleod stronghold, it was actually the stronghold of the Macdonalds. But it has a Macleod connection because a chieftain of the Macdonalds was contracted in marriage to the daughter or the sister of the Macleod chief, Margaret. And in those days, in the 1600s, we had a system of hand fasting, which was a traditional arrangement where a couple contracted to try marriage for a year and 1 day. And as long as no offspring was born in that year, or the man, and it's always the man in this, didn't get on with the woman, then he could send her home after the year and a 1 day was up, as long as no offspring had been forthcoming during that year. And so this was the arrangement between the Macdonald chief and the sister of the Macleods, and they were betrothed in this hand fasting ceremony. And for some reason, in the ensuing year, we're not quite entirely sure what happened, but the unfortunate Margaret was blinded in one eye. And Macdonald, seeing this, grew tired of her. Maybe she had lost some of her former beauty and charm, or maybe his eye had alighted on a prettier woman. And he decided that he was going to break off the marriage, and he still had time to do so. And so when the year and 1 day was up, he sat the unfortunate Margaret Macleod on a horse and sent her back to Dunvegan and to her brother. But there was more to the story than that, because Macdonald sat her upon a horse with one eye, accompanied by a one-eyed servant, and the party was guarded along the dangerous road by a one-eyed dog. And this so angered the chief of the Macleods that it sparked yet another bloody new feud between the two clans that resulted in what became known as the War of the One-Eyed Woman. All of that started here at Duntoon Castle. Now, unfortunately, looking at the clock, our journey on the Isle of Skye is coming towards an end, and we've had a jam-packed field trip around the island. And on a tour like that, as you wind down at the end of the day, then you're going to need some liquid refreshment, and there is no better place than to head to the world famous Slierken Hotel and Seamus's bar within. And I am told, I've never counted them, and much to my wife's surprise, I've never sampled all of them. You can choose from over 400 malt whiskies behind the bar at Seamus's, and just a few of them on display there. And it's been voted the whiskey bar of the year 4 years in a row. Very popular with walkers and mountaineers who have been out in the Kulin mountains, come back here at the end of the day to tell their friends of all the feats and daring do and adventures they've had out in the wild mountains. And I guess if you imbibe a bit too much in the whiskey whilst you're at Seamus's bar, you could always pop outside, and just a few footsteps away you come across the old Slierken Bridge with one of the red Cuillin in the background there, and the mighty torrents of the mountain water down below. And it is said, if you wash your face, you dipped your face in the water beneath the bridge, it will bring you eternal beauty. And I suspect if you've spent a whole evening in Seamus's bar trying one dram after a dram, then you probably need more than those waters flowing under the bridge to bring you eternal beauty the next day when you have a somewhat sore head, I am sure. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed our tour this evening. I'm just double checking to see if we have any questions, and I can see Violet has asked me how to spell Kerrang. It's a bit of an odd way of spelling it, so I've typed that in there for you, Violet. Q-U-I. It starts with Kerrang. So I hope that helps you. And yeah, I would certainly recommend having a search on Google for that poor unfortunate coach driver who got stuck there. So before I draw this evening's proceedings to a close, I just wanted to thank you for joining me again. If you had joined me last week, I'm so delighted that you joined me again. If you were new this week, thanks for coming along. And it's at this point that I have to announce what the theme for next week is going to be. So I've decided that next week's theme will be hidden harbours. We're going to explore the coastline of Scotland and a bit of our maritime heritage. So if you have any photos from a visit to Scotland that features a harbour and maybe a bit of a story about your trip here, then please do share them by emailing them to me, and I will include as many as I can during next week's photo share. And before I say goodbye, just a few other small things that I need to ask you to do. I would really appreciate your feedback on this evening's photo share, and maybe some suggestions for future themes that we can include during this coronavirus lockdown. I'll be doing these photo shares every Friday evening until something of normality returns. So in a few hours' time, hopefully you'll get an email or with a link to the replay of this evening's photo share if you wanted to go back and take another look, or if you missed anything, and a link to a feedback page, which will just take you a couple minutes to complete. And can I ask you one other thing, is if you've enjoyed this evening, to share a bit about it on Facebook and social media. Share the links to next week's photo share, and tell everyone that you know, your family and friends, that it's a great way to spend an hour on a Friday with a bit of escapism, as Andrew Baxter transports you to a bit of Scotland. So I'm just going to double check to see if there's any other questions have appeared, and there aren't. Feel free to email me if there are any questions that occur to you. And all I have to say now is goodbye, hasty back, and I hope to see you next week. Goodbye.